It's a beautiful gospel that we have today, a beautiful parable. We might be used to hearing it, but I'll invite you to think of it a little bit different. Let's recap kind of what happens first, and then I'll take you from there. So, landowner, it's a parable, right? So, Jesus is telling it about a landowner who had a vineyard. And then he goes out 5 times. One at dawn, second one 9 o'clock, third one noon, fourth time 3 p.m., and then lastly 5 p.m., just 1 hour before they were done with the workday. And so notice how from the beginning, the landowner is very clear about their wages. He tells them right away, he says, after agreeing with them for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. The usual daily wage would be about 1 denarius. That was the coin that they would use at the time. And so they agreed, I'll give you 1 denarius for working a full day. Agreed? Yes. Okay. Go out and work into my vineyard. And then he goes out again and he finds more people. And notice where the gospel says, idle in the marketplace. They were just kind of waiting around to get hired. And then he hires them. He tells them, go off to my vineyard. And then around noon and around 3 o'clock. And then notice at 5 o'clock, again, he goes out again. And then he asks them, why are you standing here all day? And the workers say, because no one has hired us. So out of the goodness of his heart, the landowner hires them. He promises a daily wage and then sends him off to his vineyard. Right? Okay, so far so good. The readings about this weekend, I think, really emphasize the theme of grace. Grace. We're so used to hearing that word, we're so used to praying with it in the Mass and everything, but think of it as a gift, right? The Catechism defines grace as a favor, the free and undeserved help that God gives us. A free and undeserved gift or help that God gives us, grace. And so, these workers, from the ones that got hired at dawn to the ones that got fired at 5 p.m., they all received grace. Because otherwise they would have stayed in the marketplace all day long just waiting to get hired, and perhaps they wouldn't have eaten that day because there was no money to buy food with. So they receive grace from the landowner, and then they go out to work. And what happens? The landowner is very tricky. Notice how it is the landowner's command or request that the foreman pays who first? Did you notice that? Did you catch that? Who gets paid first? The ones that come last, right? So that kind of like that everyone can see. It's like, pay them first and pay them what they deserve. Pay them what I promised. Pay them that 1 daily wage. And so, what happens to the ones that get hired at dawn and the ones that get hired at 9 a.m.? They become jealous. They start complaining. But let's go deeper than that. What actually happens in their hearts? They forget about that grace. Because they're comparing themselves to others, because they're looking at what the other one got, they forget about their own grace. They forget about the blessing that was having to work that day and having something or money to go buy something to eat. And so because they're comparing what others got and what they didn't get, and notice that we might be in that same position too. We might be, after a whole day of working under the sun and with all that physical labor, we might feel the same. It's like, that's not just. But notice how they're not complaining against injustice, because the landowner promised them 1 daily wage, and sure enough, they received their 1 daily wage. So it's not that the landowner is unjust. It's not that they're complaining against injustice. They're complaining against the generosity, against the goodness, and against the love of the landowner, who had a very merciful heart of saying, hey, you know what? You've been here all day and perhaps you have a family to feed. Come work at my vineyard. We're about to close. Yes, sure enough. But I'll promise you, I'll pay you what is just. And so, again, the fact that others were comparing themselves with these later workers, they forget about that grace of being hired. They forget about the grace of being called. And they forget about the grace of being invited out of the landowner's generosity, out of the landowner's goodness. My dear friends, in our daily lives, I think we can fall into that same attitude. And I think the same we see it in the parable of the prodigal son, right? Who's the younger son and who's the oldest son? The one who is looking at what the others get, that they forget about what they already have, the graces, the free gifts, so to speak, that they have already received. And so these laborers, these workers that get hired in the morning, they forget that our relationship with God, our relationship, so to speak, just following the parable with the landowner, our relationship with God is not based on merit. It's not based on what we do. Oh, the better works we do, the better the faster we'll get into heaven. No. Remember, it's all grace. It's all grace. And of course, we'll hear about St. Paul and then obviously St. James talk about faith and works. But when we forget that it is not our own merits, but it is God's grace, it is our relationship with God and Him making us His beloved sons, His beloved daughters, that is the greatest grace that we can receive. And again, unfortunately, sometimes we fall into this mentality of the early workers, the ones that get hired earlier, and we forget to look at others as our brothers and sisters. We forget that they deserve grace too, that they deserve to be called as well, just the same way we were called. And so when we forget to look at others as brothers and sisters, it's usually because we don't think ourselves, or we don't see ourselves as beloved sons and daughters. If we don't see our neighbor as sisters, as brothers, then it's because, again, we forget we're beloved sons, we're beloved daughters of the landowner. The landowner who gives us His grace, perhaps early in the day, perhaps towards the mid of our lives, perhaps towards the end of our lives, but He is so generous that He calls us all to work for His kingdom.